Welcome to the medieval tavern business, or rather, welcome to the dream that almost never matched reality. If you have ever played a fantasy game or watched a movie set in the Middle Ages, you have seen the tavern as a warm and cozy place where the owner sits behind a solid oak counter, counting gold coins while travelers laugh and drink by the fire. It looks like the perfect small business, easy recurring money, a comfortable life, but the real economics of owning a medieval tavern were so brutal that most owners barely scraped by, and many were driven out within their first few seasons. This is not a story from a game. This is the real business of the medieval tavern, far more complex and financially precarious than any fiction has ever suggested. To understand the medieval tavern, you must first unlearn everything you think it was. A tavern in the Middle Ages was not primarily a place of recreation. It was a place where people went because they had no safer alternative for basic daily hydration. Water sources in medieval towns were notoriously unreliable. Rivers carried waste from tanneries and butcher shops. Wells were polluted by nearby latrines, and even clean-looking spring water could carry diseases that nobody understood at the time. Ale, which involved boiling water as part of its production, was actually the safer daily beverage, and people of all ages, including young children, consumed what was called small ale, a very low-alcohol brew, simply to stay hydrated without getting sick. The tavern keeper was therefore in the hydration business, not the entertainment business. And this single fact shaped every aspect of the medieval tavern economy. What the tavern actually did was combine several distinct business functions under one roof. It was part brewery, part restaurant, part inn, part stable, and part community gathering space. Each of these functions came with its own costs, risks, and operational demands. The successful tavern keeper was not just a friendly face behind a counter. They had to master brewing chemistry, food preservation, animal care, accounting, personnel management, and local politics. And even with all those skills, financial success was never guaranteed. The single largest hurdle any aspiring tavern keeper faced was the cost of construction or acquisition of the building itself. A medieval tavern was not a simple wooden structure. It had to be large enough to house a common room with a massive fireplace capable of warming the entire space, a separate kitchen that could feed dozens of people at a time, a dedicated brewing room, storage cellars for ale and food, stables for the horses of travelers, and sleeping quarters for lodgers. The location of this building was critical and commanded a premium price. A tavern on a major pilgrimage route near a busy market square, or at a crossroads where trade routes converged, could expect far more traffic than one on a quiet side street. Constructing a tavern required substantial quantities of properly seasoned timber, stone for the foundation and fireplace, lime for mortar and whitewash, clay tiles or thatch for the roof, and glass for any windows. Glass was extraordinarily expensive in the medieval period, and was often a luxury that only the wealthiest establishments could afford. The labor costs were equally significant. Carpenters, masons, and general laborers all had to be paid skilled wages, and a master carpenter could earn several times what a common laborer made, but his work was essential for the structural integrity of the building. The brewing equipment alone represented a major capital investment. The tavern keeper needed large copper or iron cauldrons for boiling the wort, vessels so large that moving them required multiple strong workers, and they were made of metal that was expensive to produce and shape. Fermentation vessels made of wood or earthenware had to be completely watertight and carefully maintained to prevent contamination of the ale, and wooden barrels of many sizes were needed for storing and serving the finished product. Each barrel had to be made by a skilled cooper who charged premium prices for quality work that would not leak. The common room needed sturdy oak tables and benches that could withstand years of heavy daily use. The kitchen needed spits for roasting meat, large pots for cooking stews and soups, griddles for baking bread and flat cakes, knives and cutting boards, and storage containers for flour, salt, and dry goods. The sleeping quarters required beds with straw mattresses that had to be replaced periodically, along with blankets and pillows for each guest. The stables needed stalls, hay racks, water troughs, and basic tools. And the entire property had to be enclosed to prevent boundary disputes with neighbors. When all of these costs were added together, the initial investment required to open a tavern was equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn over several years of labor, and for most ordinary people, this was an insurmountable barrier to entry. Once the tavern was built and operational, the ongoing expenses began immediately and never stopped. The single largest recurring cost was the procurement of ingredients for brewing ale. Malted barley had to be purchased from maltsters who had specialized equipment to process the raw grain. Or the tavern keeper had to do the malting themselves, which required additional dedicated space, time, and physical labor. The grain supply was entirely subject to the whims of agricultural output. A bad harvest or a season of too much rain meant that grain prices could spike dramatically, squeezing profit margins to the breaking point within a matter of weeks. The tavern also needed a constant supply of bread, cheese, salted meat, and potage for its guests. This meant purchasing flour from millers and preserving meat through salting, smoking, or drying. And the cost of salt alone was significant because it had to be transported inland from coastal regions at considerable expense by cart or pack animal. Fuel was another massive and unavoidable cost. The great fireplace in the common room had to burn continuously, especially during the cold winter months. The kitchen fires had to be maintained all day for cooking, and the brewing process required sustained strong heat over many hours. This meant purchasing enormous quantities of firewood throughout the year. And as towns grew and local forests were gradually depleted, the price of firewood rose steadily, forcing tavern keepers to travel farther or pay more for every log. Lighting was a cost that modern people rarely consider, but that added up significantly over time. Before gas and electric lighting, taverns used tallow candles, oil lamps, or simple rushlights to illuminate the common room. After darkness fell, tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat and produced a dim, smoky light that had to be constantly trimmed and tended. While beeswax candles were far brighter and cleaner but prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest establishments, staff wages represented another significant recurring expense that could not be avoided. A tavern of any reasonable size needed at least one skilled brewer to manage ale production, a cook to prepare food, several servants to serve guests and clean the common room, a stable hand to care for the horses, and perhaps a porter to manage the door. Each of these employees had to be paid, housed, and fed, and these labor costs added substantially to the weekly operating expenses. Taxes and fees imposed by local authorities were yet another relentless burden on the tavern keeper's finances. In many medieval communities, the operation of a tavern was not a free enterprise available to anyone. It was a privilege granted by the local lord, the town council, or the church. And that privilege came at a price. Tavern keepers often had to pay an annual license fee simply for the right to operate their business, and on top of this recurring fee, they owed a portion of their earnings to the lord of the manor in the form of various taxes. In some regions, the lord had the legal right to set the maximum price of ale and to inspect its quality at any time. Official ale tasters appointed by the authorities could fine or even shut down a tavern that did not meet established standards for strength and purity. The maintenance and repair of the building and its equipment was a constant and unpredictable expense. The thatched roof that kept the rain out in spring might need patching by autumn. The wooden furniture that survived a busy summer could develop cracks and structural weakness by winter. The brewing cauldrons that were essential to the business could develop leaks requiring expensive metalwork repairs. The stables required regular cleaning, and the clay or earthen floors of the common room, packed down by countless feet every day, needed to be refreshed with new material or covered with fresh rushes on a regular basis to maintain basic standards of cleanliness. These costs were not optional. A tavern with a leaking roof, a broken bench, or a foul-smelling common room would quickly lose its customers to better-maintained competitors, and in the small communities where most medieval taverns operated, reputation was everything. If the costs were so high and the profit margins so thin, what exactly kept the medieval tavern business alive? The answer lies in the multiple streams of revenue that a well-managed tavern could generate simultaneously. Ale sales were by far the most important and reliable source of income. The tavern keeper purchased malted barley in bulk, brewed it into ale, and sold it by the pint to customers who had no other dependable source of safe hydration. The markup on ale over the cost of ingredients could be substantial, but only if brewing was efficient and the ale sold before it spoiled, because ale without hops was highly perishable and had to be consumed within days. This meant the keeper had to carefully match production to expected traffic. Brewing too much meant spoiled inventory and total loss, while brewing too little meant turning away customers. The most successful keepers developed an intuitive understanding of their market, knowing exactly how much to brew and when. Food sales provided a second revenue stream. Travelers needed to eat. And while some carried their own provisions, most preferred a hot meal over cold, dried rations. The markup on prepared food was generally not as high as on ale, but volume and the ability to use leftovers in soups meant food still contributed meaningfully. Lodging was the third major source of income for taverns with sleeping accommodations. Travelers needed a place to sleep at night, and while accommodations were far from luxurious, often a shared bed with other guests, lodging revenue was almost pure profit. Once furnishing costs were recovered, the straw mattresses had to be replaced periodically and the linens washed. But these costs were minor compared to the nightly charge. The stabling of horses was another important revenue stream along well-traveled routes. Travelers on horseback needed a safe place for their animals overnight with hay and oats and a stable hand to watch them. The fee for stabling was often comparable to lodging a human guest. And since hay and oats were relatively cheap, the profit margin on stabling could be attractive. Some keepers also generated income by hosting local events and gatherings. Weddings, guild meetings, court sessions, and market day auctions frequently held in taverns because they were the largest indoor spaces in most towns, and the keeper could charge for the space while benefiting from extra ale and food sales. Creating a profitable synergy, another overlooked income source was selling surplus ale to other establishments or directly to households. A keeper who brewed more efficiently than competitors could become a small-scale wholesaler, selling barrels to other taverns, to wealthy households, or to travelers who wanted ale for their journey. This wholesale business operated on thinner margins but moved large volumes quickly, reducing spoilage risk and improving brewing efficiency. In some regions, tavern keepers also earned money as informal bankers, holding coins for safekeeping, exchanging currency for travelers, or extending credit to trusted locals who would repay on market day or after harvest. This was risky and required careful record keeping, but the service fees added another layer of income. The most successful taverns maximized synergy between these streams. A traveler who stopped for ale might stay for a meal. A guest who ate might rent a room, and a lodger would certainly pay to stable their horse. Each service fed into the others, creating a cumulative effect greater than the sum of its parts. For all the potential revenue that a tavern could generate, the risks and vulnerabilities were equally substantial, and many keepers found themselves ruined despite their best efforts. The single most common problem was the spoilage of ale. Because unhopped ale had a shelf life measured in just a few days, any interruption in customer traffic due to bad weather, a local festival elsewhere, a quarantine, or a change in travel patterns could leave the keeper with entire barrels of sour, undrinkable ale. The grain, fuel, and labor that had been invested in that ale were lost entirely. And a few such losses in quick succession could wipe out the operating capital of even a well-established business. The volatility of grain prices posed a second existential threat, because malted barley was the single largest input cost for the tavern's primary product. Any significant increase in grain prices cut directly into the keeper's profit margin. And during years of severe harvest failure caused by drought, flood, or unseasonable cold, grain prices could multiply several times over, making it completely impossible to brew ale at a price that ordinary customers could afford. The keeper faced an impossible choice: raise prices to cover costs and watch customers go to competitors, or keep prices stable and operate at a loss. Either way, the business suffered dramatically, and many taverns simply closed their doors permanently during famine years. Unable to weather the storm, theft was a constant and insidious problem that slowly drained the profits of many taverns over time. Servants who handled the ale or the money could easily skim a little for themselves, pocketing coins from unrecorded sales or watering down the ale to stretch the supply while keeping the difference. Kitchen staff could pilfer food supplies, stable hands could overcharge guests for hay and pocket the extra, and customers could steal cups, utensils, linens, or anything else not locked away. Detecting and preventing this constant leakage required relentless vigilance from the owner, but the owner could not be everywhere at once, and a single dishonest employee could cause significant financial damage over weeks or months before finally being caught. The problem of customers who could not or would not pay their accumulated tabs was another persistent drain on tavern finances. Many transactions in the medieval economy were conducted on credit, with payment expected at a specified future date. When the customer would have access to cash, a farmer might run a substantial tab during the winter months and promise to pay after the spring market. A traveling merchant might consume food and lodging for several days and ask to settle his bill when his trade goods were sold. Extending credit to regular customers and guests alike was an essential part of doing business and maintaining goodwill. But it also meant the tavern keeper was constantly carrying a portfolio of unpaid debts that could grow to a dangerous size when a customer moved away or simply refused to honor their debt. The keeper had very limited legal options for recovery and usually had to write off the entire amount as a total loss. Accumulated bad debts could easily consume the entire profit of an otherwise successful business over a period of years. Fire was one of the most catastrophic risks faced by any medieval business, and taverns were particularly vulnerable because of the inherent combination of open flames, highly flammable building materials like timber and thatch, and large quantities of combustible goods, including ale, cooking oil, firewood, and dried rushes on the floor. The great fireplace that made the common room warm and inviting was also a constant source of danger. A single stray spark landing unnoticed on a pile of dry rushes, a tallow candle knocked over by a drowsy customer, or a kitchen fire that grew too large and spread to the walls could reduce the entire tavern to smoldering ashes in a matter of hours without anything resembling modern property insurance. A fire meant total and irreversible financial ruin. The building that had cost years of savings to construct, the equipment that was essential to operations, the inventory that represented the keeper's working capital, everything was lost in a single night, and the owner had no insurance company to turn to for compensation. Rebuilding was possible only if the keeper had substantial personal savings or could borrow from family or wealthy patrons, and most did not have access to that kind of resources. Changes in the local economy or in regional travel patterns could destroy a tavern's customer base almost overnight. The rerouting of a major road to a different valley, the decline of a once busy market, the relocation of an annual festival to a different town, the construction of a new bridge that changed the way travelers moved through the entire region. Any of these developments could reduce the flow of paying customers to a mere trickle, and once the customers stopped coming, the tavern's revenue dried up with alarming speed. The costs of maintaining the building, paying the staff, and servicing debts did not go away just because the customers had vanished. Competition from other taverns was another constant threat, especially in towns with multiple establishments serving the same pool of customers. A price war could eliminate profits for everyone involved. The successful keeper had to differentiate through quality, atmosphere, location, or service. But these advantages were difficult to sustain and could be eroded by a new competitor. Opening across the street, the legal and regulatory environment also posed significant risks. Tavern keepers operated under licenses granted by local authorities, and those licenses could be revoked at any time if the owner fell out of favor. Operating without a license was illegal and could result in fines or confiscation of equipment. The keeper had to navigate a complex web of political relationships, maintaining goodwill with everyone who held power over their business. A single dispute with a neighbor or complaint from a powerful customer could result in the loss of the license and the end of the business. The seasonal nature of the medieval economy created additional financial stress. Winter brought fewer travelers, shorter daylight hours, and higher fuel costs that ate into whatever revenue was generated. Summer might bring a flood of pilgrims or merchants passing through, but also brought the risk of spoiled food and the challenge of keeping ale from spoiling too quickly. The keeper had to manage finances carefully throughout the year, setting aside profits from the busy seasons to carry through the slow ones, and any miscalculation could lead to a shortfall that forced the business to close. So, what was it really like to own a medieval tavern when you strip away the romantic fantasy? The reality was a life of constant physical labor, chronic financial anxiety, and relentless day-to-day problem solving. The tavern keeper was awake before dawn every morning to begin the brewing process, tending the fire under the great cauldron, watching the temperature of the mash, checking the fermentation, and planning the day's food preparations based on what ingredients were available and affordable. The common room had to be cleaned and prepared for the day's customers. The fire had to be stoked, the rushes on the floor replaced, the tables wiped down, and the ale barrels checked and tapped. Throughout the day and well into the evening, the keeper and their staff served an endless stream of customers, local regulars who came for their daily ale, weary travelers who needed a hot meal and a bed, merchants who wanted to discuss business deals in a warm corner, pilgrims making their way to a distant shrine. Each customer had to be greeted warmly, served promptly, and in some cases managed carefully to prevent disagreements from escalating into problems that would scare away other paying guests. The keeper had to constantly observe their guests, knowing when to intervene and when to let minor irritations resolve themselves. They had to watch the door and monitor their staff, making sure no one was pocketing coins or giving away free drinks. The bookkeeping, such as it was in an era when many keepers had only basic literacy, involved keeping careful track of who owed what, how much grain had been used, how much ale had been sold and how much remained, how much had been lost to spoilage, how much had been paid in taxes, and how much remained to purchase supplies for the coming week. The accounting systems were primitive, and many keepers operated largely on intuition and accumulated experience, trusting their instincts to tell them whether the business was on solid ground or heading toward disaster. The social position of the tavern keeper was an uncomfortable mix of respect and suspicion on one hand. The keeper was a property owner and an important figure in the local economy, serving as a hub for news and social connection. On the other hand, the church preached against taverns as places of temptation and vice, and authorities sometimes imposed restrictions on when the tavern could operate and who could be served. The keeper had to navigate this moral ambiguity constantly, maintaining a personal reputation as a respectable business owner, while running an establishment many considered a necessary evil. The financial returns of the medieval tavern were modest for the vast majority of owners. The daily revenue from ale, food, lodging, and stabling could look reasonable at the end of a busy week, but the operating costs were so relentlessly high that the net profit remaining for the owner was often surprisingly small. All of those expenses, the grain and hops, the firewood and candles, the staff wages and the cost of feeding them, the taxes and license fees, the building maintenance and equipment repairs, the spoilage losses and the bad debts and the quiet theft, they all consumed the gross revenue before the owner could take their share. What remained was usually enough to live on at a modest level, but not nearly enough to get rich, and certainly not enough to provide real financial security against the many risks the business faced. A keeper who was exceptionally skilled, fortunate, and careful might eventually accumulate enough over a decade or two to retire in modest comfort or pass the business to their children. But for everyone who achieved this modest prosperity, several others struggled every day just to keep their doors open and eventually sold at a loss to the next optimistic newcomer. The grinding daily reality of the medieval tavern was a business of inches, a constant battle to keep costs low, quality high, customers happy, and problems contained. It demanded every hour of the owner's waking day and left little room for rest. The image of the carefree tavern keeper living a life of ease was always just a romantic fantasy created by people who had never actually done the work. The real medieval tavern keeper was a tired, worried, hard-working person who woke before the sun and slept only lightly, who counted every single penny and watched every single barrel with anxious eyes, who knew from hard experience that one bad batch of ale, one season of bad weather, one dishonest employee, or one greedy landlord could undo years of careful work in a matter of weeks. And yet, despite all of these overwhelming challenges, the medieval tavern remained one of the most vital and enduring institutions of its time, because the fundamental human need that it served was universal. People needed a place where they could drink water that would not make them sick, where they could eat a warm meal when far from home, where they could rest after a long day of travel, and where they could connect with their community and share news with their neighbors, and someone had to be willing to provide that place despite all of the hardships. The tavern keeper accepted that burden and all of the financial and personal risks that came with it. And by doing so, they became an indispensable part of the medieval social and economic fabric. The next time you find yourself sitting in your favorite local pub or tavern, take a quiet moment to appreciate the centuries of history and hard work that stand behind the simple act of walking through the door. Think about the countless tavern keepers who came before you, who stoked the fire before dawn each morning, tapped the barrel with practiced skill, and welcomed the weary stranger with genuine warmth. And think about the real economics that made all of that possible, not the fantasy economics of overflowing gold coins and effortless profits, but the real economics of honest hard work, razor-thin margins, constant and unrelenting risk, and the enduring and profoundly human need for a place to call home away from home.